Challenging Your WordPress Assumptions. My name is Andy Nacin, one of the lead developers for WordPress. I actually live here in Washington, D.C., so this was fairly convenient for me to get to. Just had to fight the metro. I want to talk to you today about challenging your WordPress assumptions from 2009. When I speak with PHP developers, for the most part, they say, you know, WordPress is bad or whatever their feedback might be, and then they add, well, I haven't really looked at it since 2009. It's almost always 2009, sometimes 2008 or 2007. Every once in a while, it's like, I haven't seen it since movable type was still around. It's always kind of different, but I think this is a really interesting year because in 2009 was really the last year before a pretty major shift in WordPress development and really how we do things, what we've done. And so I kind of want to just go through some of these assumptions and then maybe beat some of them back or validate some others. So the first one is that WordPress is insecure. Well, yes, definitely, absolutely used to be. I will let you know now that I came onto the project at the end of 2009, which is really convenient. However, it was really bad. It wasn't doing anything like, you know, preparing any of its queries. There was SQL injection everywhere. It didn't even have the concept of protection for like CSRF vulnerabilities until 2007. There were a lot of things that, you know, it did not do well at all for the first few years of its life. That said, we're now doing things the right way. And the right way can be defined as a number of different ways. Well, first off, of course, it's, you know, secure now and using best practices, but also we're starting to do other best practices, whether it's engaging with outside researchers, actually conducting regular security audits and paying for them, running a bug bounty, running a vulnerability bounty program, even fixing vulnerabilities in Drupal when we have the chance. So working with other projects, doing things like that, doing actual like, hey, proper CVE requests, would you imagine that? Hey, we're now doing things the right way. At the same time, we also looked at it, we realized, you know, there are other things that we can do to make this better. So last year, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, is automatic updates for security releases, which people are like, oh God, a self-updating PHP application, that sounds even scarier. Don't worry, it is, but I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow. That said, now whenever we have a security release, we can push that out really quickly to the point where we can update easily 10 million sites in an hour. That's a lot of sites immediately getting protection. Now, including this site, which is actually Usain Bolt's site, so pretty fast. That said, like, we're also a pretty big, massive target. We have a target on our back. We're up to 23.5% of the top 10 million websites. There are a lot of sites out there that can easily get hacked. What ends up happening for the most part is that we're dealing with really bad passwords, which we've been working with users about. We've also been dealing with things like maybe like insecure plugins, bad server configurations, shared hosts where like the Titanic, the bulkheads don't go all the way up to the ceiling. And we have all these issues pretty constantly. So really to combat this, of course we can do different things. We've worked on a number of different techniques, but one is that as part of auto updates, we also added the ability for us to just force push a plugin update. So if there's an insecure plugin or a malicious plugin or spammy or whatever it is, we can now push that out to every single site that has that plugin instantly. The same way that you might have this happen with, you know, you have certain settings that are on maybe your Windows machine or Apple or, of course, your phones as well will be able to do this. So WordPress can as well. Even though it's this, you know, self-updating PHP application, hey, it can handle this. Another assumption is too many updates, which, I mean, I already explained to you that we can just push them out really whenever. So how does this kind of work? And for us, we do 3 major releases a year. That said, they're not really major releases because we don't break backwards compatibility. We try not to, at least. So our major releases are really, if you're looking at like semantic versioning, they're minor releases, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, we're adding new features, but we're not breaking anything. If you wrote something 5-6 years ago, like the WordPress way, it should still work now, which is pretty insane when you think about it. And you start looking at, you know, there are other frameworks, and you know, you can look at like AngularJS, and they're not even planning on a way to get from 1.0 to 2.0. There's no even like path forward for that. And for us, this idea of like a major version is, well, it's new features, it's improved, it's faster, it's going to be better, but we're not dealing with breaking things. So we are, of course, doing patch releases as needed. So whether it's bug fixes for that major release or security releases, this is fine. That said, it does seem like WordPress sometimes updates every week, which is not really the case. I think we did maybe 15 releases last year, including major and minor. But with auto updates, users no longer really notice. They cannot pay attention to this major release schedule of every 4 months, and that's it. They don't even need to worry about this minor release update because it's already shipped to them. If you saw a talk earlier on 21 ways to make your WordPress site go fast, with some bonus ones, you already know that this assumption is wrong. WordPress can scale, in fact, very easily. Often it might be as simple as just throwing like an Nginx proxy in front of it, or just having it run on Nginx to begin with, and that's going to be the vast majority of your problems right there solved. You can look at much larger sites, whether you're looking at maybe WordPress.com, which is of course the largest site out there, which hosts tens of millions of websites on all not too many servers and very few sysadmins compared to what a normal project might require. It can scale, and it can scale very easily. Another assumption is that WordPress is legacy software. Well, PHP is too. So in fact, when I hear this from people, for the most part, I always hear like, WordPress is legacy because it's PHP. I only ever hear WordPress is legacy without the because it's PHP part from other PHP people. That's it. So PHP is fighting this the same exact way that WordPress is, and it's legacy. Well, really though, like, we don't really care that PHP is legacy. We use PHP because it happens to be everywhere. This is honestly the same reason why we're using MySQL. It's the same reason why Drupal and Joomla are using the same stack by default. It's because it happens to work everywhere out of the box. We end up taking a lot of heat for this, but ultimately we are everywhere. WordPress can run everywhere, and we end up running so many sites because of the commitment to backwards compatibility and because of its debt and its technical debt that it deliberately maintains to avoid giving the users that burden, not because of it, or not in spite of it, rather. Going along these same lines is another assumption that WordPress is not object-oriented. Yep, pretty much. Mostly procedural, a lot of functions. That said, we do use objects where it makes the most sense. And if you saw Paul Jones's talk earlier about these kind of incremental improvements, no, we're not wrapping everything in a class and turning everything static, but what we can do is we can do some really interesting things like, oh, we have this array that we were passing around previously. This is silly. This should be an object. Let's convert it to an object, but let's make it an array object and use array access to make it so it's fully backwards compatible, more performant at the same time, and we can actually start to add functionality on it. So something like a post is indeed an object in WordPress because that makes sense, of course, and we're starting to do this more and more throughout the system, really incrementally as needed. For us, our focus remains on simplicity. And that can sound kind of odd when you're looking at maybe like a tangled mess. But for us, what we're really focusing on is like a low barrier to entry for people who often aren't actually developers, but want to write code. The same way that, well, really like this assumption of like the code is terrible, and yeah, actually, probably partially true. The same way in this case is that like PHP also has this issue where it has this kind of stigma, and it has a stigma of like, it's not object-oriented. Or that, oh, well, that was kind of bolted on later. Well, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing as well. I want to explain, if you've heard of the ship of Theseus as a really fun paradox. If you have an entire wooden ship, and over a long period of time you replace and repair every single board on that ship, is it still the same ship? And this has been a philosophical paradox for years, and they've always, centuries, I believe, and they've always talked about this idea of like, is it the same ship, yes or no? And if you ask two different philosophers or two different developers, they're going to say, well, yes or no. In the developer's case, it might just be whether he forked it and decided to rename the project or whether he's actually working with the project itself. This kind of incremental approach to writing WordPress is exactly what we've been happening. So a project like Drupal, and not to pick on them at all, they're doing, in the span of maybe 3 or 4 years, a major rewrite from the ground up. In that same time, we're doing 12 to 15 major releases, in which we're rewriting a significant amount of the underbelly, but we're not breaking anything in the process, and we're shipping releases often enough where users can be getting those features. So when you're adopting WordPress, you're really hopping on a single train ride because you're not dealing with this issue of like you need to hop off and switch to another version at the end of it. It forces us to think a lot more critically because we can't just rewrite everything that we want to, but at the same time, it's not that we're going any slower because you just end up seeing a lot of these incremental updates. Another assumption is that WordPress has no tests, and I hear this all the time. They download the zip, they open it up, and they see WP includes, WP admin, WP content, and they're like, where are the tests? Well, they're not there, but they are in our main repository. So we have source, we have test, we have unit tests in both PHP and JavaScript. We use PHP unit and QUnit for that. Hey, it works. It's really cool. And on top of that, another random assumption is that most people are like, oh, WordPress is still in Subversion. Well, we mirror back and forth, so it doesn't really matter which one you want to use. That's pretty cool. At this point, we're doing, what everyone else does, is that we're not touching anything unless it has tests. This is standard and obvious to most, but most people are like, I don't know, what do you guys do to test? You just like refresh the page and hope it works? For a long time, yeah, that actually probably is a pretty good way of this kind of spot check as to how it worked or how it didn't. Another assumption is that WordPress uses old PHP versions. This one's true. WordPress right now, its minimum version is 5.2.4. This will not change for a while. There are a few reasons why. A corollary here is that WordPress also doesn't work on the latest PHP. I saw this when PHP 5.6 was released, when 5.5 was released, when 5.4 was released. It was, hey, does WordPress even work on this? Probably not. Hey, guess what? It does. And usually without any real changes that need to happen. Our recommended is PHP 5.5 plus. It works on 5.6. It worked on 5.6 on day 1, on day 0, even during betas. And we're also now using our relationship with hosts to specifically push them to update their versions of PHP to the latest. So to 5.5 or higher, MySQL to 5.5 or higher, preferably 5.6, and also to push all of their WordPress sites to the latest as well. That said, we're not going to bump our minimum version. And this was something that, for example, the Go PHP 5 movement originally articulated. This idea of like, hey, if you just bump the minimum version, everyone will jump. Well, it took 3 or 4 years, so that didn't really work. We're bypassing users entirely on this. We don't want users to be in this kind of political mess. For them, the software works. For us, the vast majority of the time, our users don't even know what PHP is. Forget about how they're going to update it. So what we're doing instead is that we're not going to go ahead and abandon what could be easily millions of users who are still running a 5.2 site, but instead we're actively looking at where they all are on all these different hosts. And this is only going to help PHP as a whole and identify, oh, hey, there's a ton of PHP 5.2 sites on GoDaddy or wherever it might be, engaging with them to say, let's just update all of them. Or at least let's identify all the ones that have WordPress sites and update all of them. Because ultimately, they're not worried about breaking WordPress, which is what everyone kind of thinks when they're looking at these shared hosts. They're really worried about breaking all the other crappy PHP applications other than WordPress that are actually causing these problems. WordPress is very portable because we code to a very low common denominator. And this is one of the reasons why it ends up just working on later versions of PHP, because we're not doing a whole lot of special things. For us, the users come first. We do focus on building user-centric software. This is why we're not going to go ahead and throw them in the middle of a fight and say like, hey, update your PHP, because they have no idea what that means. We can tell them update your browser because at this point that's public consciousness of Chrome versus Firefox. Even the nightly news reports are going to be reporting on a vulnerability in one of those. No one has any idea what the language is. They don't care. They shouldn't need to care, which is really our opinion on this. Another assumption is that WordPress uses the MySQL extension. This isn't true anymore. In fact, not only do we not use it, we did not stop using it by kicking and screaming. Rather, when there was this massive discussion in PHP internals debating whether they should even deprecate it, and there were a lot of arguments saying, well, WordPress, they would never be able to migrate off of it. It's so difficult to go to the improved extension or to PDO or anything else like that. We stepped up and we said, no, just do it. We'll follow you, that's fine, but like if you're using us as an excuse, this is silly, it's old, you don't want it anymore, just deprecate it, we'll deal with it. It took us like 6 months, and even then it was because we were busy, building features for users, and then we just flipped the switch, and now they're all using MySQLi if it exists. Now we're starting to get into some of the more meatier ones of like WordPress is just a blog, or it's not a CMS, all right? And PHP isn't a real programming language, which is what you hear a lot all the time as well. For this, we can start to look at where it is being used in this case. So for example, the New Yorker has 100 years worth of content, 125 years worth of content, I believe, all through WordPress. Time Magazine, same thing. They've been around since like 1908. AMC, this is actually, I love this site because not only do they have like, okay, fine, anyone can host a news website. That's easy. It's just like blog posts and articles. Well, in this case, every show, every episode, every character, every actor is specifically an individual piece of content that are then tied together based on what shows they're in, what episodes they're in. Very similar to like the Internet Movie Database, but specifically for AMC and all of their shows. It's all powered directly through WordPress. And so in 2010, another thing that we added was this, hey, this like multi-site feature of, it was originally existed as a fork of WordPress, but it shared like 99% of the code because we love to repeat ourselves. And we merged it in, and now we can do things all in one installation. It's really pretty handy. This, for example, is, if you've heard of WordCamps, they are locally organized WordPress conferences. There's been something like 500 of them over the years. Every year we almost like double the number that are had. And this is an easy way we can manage like users globally and sites globally and all this other stuff. A lot of other CMSs have this. My point, I guess, is that WordPress does too. We also have this idea of like custom content and custom taxonomies. So everyone knows at this point probably WordPress has posts, it has pages, it has tags, and it has categories. And everyone's like, it's a blog. You can have an about page and you have your blog stuff and you can tag and categorize them. Well, yes, it does have that, but it has a lot more than that too. This is just an example of the WordCamp San Francisco site from earlier this year, where everything is being managed through here. Whether we're dealing with forums for the attendees, the actual ticket sales are all going through here. Each of these are different pieces of content. Where we have organizers, sponsors, speakers, all of this is going right through WordPress as individual pieces. You see that blog is there, pages isn't even there because they're not even using it for this site. Another assumption along these lines of like the power of its authentication and capabilities APIs with WordPress, and that we have no fine-grained user roles. You have an administrator, an editor, an author, a contributor, and that's it. And that's true for users, but there's a lot more than that. The underlying API is really powerful. If you wanted to do something like, hey, users can edit their comments as long as it's within 30 minutes and it's an even numbered comment and it wasn't a reply to someone else or that someone hasn't already replied to it, you could write that little tiny bit of business logic and just use it and it'll work. On the fly, you're not modifying all these role definitions or anything like that. It's incredibly flexible and incredibly powerful. If you want to make it so one user can only edit like this one tree of pages and not any other page, you can do that extremely easily, however really you want. There are plugins that do this for you. You can write the very simple code to do this for you. It's there. So no more complaining about that one. Another assumption, and this one most people do walk in as like, well, WordPress, at least it's a good user experience. Yes, I will go with true for this assumption. That said, it's gotten a lot better since 2009. Significantly better, in fact. This is not something that we're kind of resting our laurels from. There are still constant user tests that are happening, constant new feature development. Many times these new features are designed to just rip out the old ones. That way we can replace it with something better, all without breaking anything, too. So we do crazy stuff now, like, you know, when you're auto-saving, we never want you to lose your post, so we're saving that in your browser. Something like this, where we have this, you know, really cool revisions UI, that you can just kind of scroll back and forth and see all of your changes live. Or, hey, you know, you lost your connection at the coffee shop. Whoa, hold on there. We're like saving this for you, like locally, until you actually want to go ahead and publish this. Now, there are plenty of applications that do this. Gmail, of course, does this really well. There aren't a whole lot of PHP applications that do this, but certainly we weren't in 2009 either. This media management, which I think is really cool, a lot of people still don't like it, but they're totally spoiled because it's about 10 times better than almost anything else out there. Certainly on a web application, whether it's PHP or otherwise, it's really great. We're only trying to make it even better. But we have this like really nice UI that's actually functional and has been user tested dozens of times to see that it's working well. But we still don't think it's even that great, which means it's only going to get better from there. Focusing on visual editing, where we use TinyMCE with like a lot of other projects. But for us, we're really digging a lot deeper into there to try and make it so, hey, what you are editing is truly what you're getting. You have live previews. If you paste in a YouTube link, it immediately embeds the video. You can even play it from there. Paste in a tweet, it just embeds that tweet directly in the editor. That way, what you're seeing on the back end is exactly what you're seeing on the front end as well. Another very common assumption is that, well, WordPress is a toy. It's a blog. It's a toy. And, you know, in some cases, it certainly can be. It can be for your cat's website, like Grumpy Cat. It can also be for, hey, your band, like Rolling Stones, or Beyonce also happens to use WordPress as well. And so this is good, and WordPress can be a toy for these folks, or for their PR companies, or for your random blog about whatever it is you want to write about. But it also is used by a lot of others. So for example, I can take this list of the top 10 US newspapers for print circulation, and I can highlight out the New York Daily News as the only one that does not use WordPress for a significant amount of their workflow. Now, granted, it's a little odd to be comparing print circulation with digital, but nonetheless, All of those other ones employ WordPress people. They employ top WordPress people doing these cool things. NASA, whether it's their open data initiative or different academies or other sites, they're using WordPress all the time. And I like to think that they kind of know what they're doing with engineering. Also, you might have heard this little VC firm called Google Ventures, or maybe like Microsoft, where blogs.microsoft.com, all WordPress. All of the MSDN blogs, all like 6,000 of them, are all moving over because they're like, hey, we want to use the tool that makes sense for this. Or you can look at Facebook, which this is their newsroom. Their newsroom is on WordPress, but also about 6 or 7 other of their little subsites are specifically powered by this tool. So it could be a toy for some, but it's obviously a professional publishing platform for a lot of others. There are very similar assumptions along these lines of like, it's shameful to use. I don't want to deploy this because like I'm a real developer and WordPress is WordPress. And in many cases, it's PHP is PHP. Or you have this idea of like there's no money in it. Because, you know, obviously, other than it being open source, but also like the plugins, they're all free and they're all junk, and there's some paid stuff, but it's all really cheap. And, you know, average WordPress developers making like minimum wage and all this other stuff. You also have this idea of like it's just a tool for bad freelancers. Now, I can also say that it's also, PHP is just a tool for bad programmers, right? Like we've all heard this before as well. It's the same kind of assumption of this. And what I like to think is that first off, like PHP is a gateway drug for programming. We've all kind of thought about this and that so many people have gotten involved in programming through PHP. They might not use PHP anymore, but this is how they got involved. Why? Because it's so easy. It's also why there's a ton of script kiddies out there. It's also why 78% of the web is powered by PHP. At the same time, WordPress is in many ways the gateway drug for web development in general and also for PHP. There are few PHP developers that didn't experiment with WordPress back in 2007 when they were first trying things out. There are a few web developers now who didn't like, oh yeah, I've done WordPress before. Sometimes they're like, I don't anymore, but absolutely I fiddled around with it years ago. It's in fact how I learned CSS, because I was playing around with the theme editor. The reality is that there's such a long tail that it results in there being just more jobs out there. So you can see this posting for like, I have a junior WordPress developer. There's tons of them. I can get, if you want a job, I'm sure we can find you a job for it. That said, like there's also like really good WordPress developers are paid top dollar. And they're paid top dollar by really good companies as well. And what we have here is just in WordPress alone, not even PHP or open source CMS, whatever it is, it's $1 billion industry, easily. When you're looking at the products and services that support the hosting companies that are making money off of this, it's absolutely huge. And so we look at all these consulting companies in the WordPress space. There are dozens of them that are all pulling in millions of dollars a year just purely in consulting. Some of them are employing 80 people, 100 people. All built around this same consulting model. Or they're also selling products, they're selling themes, they're selling designs, or they're just doing that basic kind of consulting of like, hey, yes, you know, this one person needs like a $2,000 website for their bakery. That exists, but so does the $400,000 website. And I'm not saying that this is how much that Vogue costs, but Vogue is powered by WordPress because, well, they hired some really serious WordPress talent to be able to do this. They hired good senior developers to do this. Or Wired, or TechCrunch, or Pando, or Recode. All of them employ really good WordPress people or contract out with good WordPress shops to be able to do all of this. Because the long tail really is that long. There's nothing wrong with someone paying $2,000 for a website. You were never going to hire them to build a custom thing, ever. But that $2,000, that's really easy to be able to do this. I'm not saying that I would ever do it for that, because I'm not interested in working on that. But the pie is so much larger than we really think about sometimes. If you look at other sites like Quartz, which is Atlantic Media, the New York Times employs one of the WordPress core developers. And one of our other top contributors happens to work at the New York Times. The Washington Post employs my predecessor at my student newspaper from many, many years ago to build like awesome WordPress stuff. On election night 2012, 80% of their traffic went through WordPress. The New York Times, in any given day, they have like 200-something developers. They have like 4 who focus on WordPress, and it's on like 50% of their traffic. That's not a bad calculation when you really think about it. And then we get to some other assumptions on WordPress not really having very good documentation. You've probably, if you've played around with WordPress ever, you've poked around with the codex and you're like, oh my god, what is this? It's MediaWiki, for goodness sake, right? And you start to realize, oh, this is nearly as good as it can be. Well, there is a lot more here that can happen. We have a very heavy emphasis on developer documentation and on developer training. Because we want to not only make WordPress easier to use, but of course easier to learn. Because as low as the barrier to entry is, I still don't, and no one still thinks that it's nearly low enough. So we do a lot of other things here, for example, that if you've heard of PSR 5, we not only follow along but actively contribute to it, because this is what we're using for all of our inline docs. And not only for functions and classes, but we extended it even further, where if you've played with WordPress before and you know what, it has this hooks and actions and filter system, kind of like this global event bus, if you will. We documented all 3,800 of them, and then we piped them all into a website, just like php.net or api.jquery.com, which, by the way, is also powered by WordPress. And we now have this like awesome set of developer documentation that people can use. And this is really important because like this idea of, the lack of documentation, if there's one thing that PHP as a language does really well, is that it has documentation. For all 3,000 global functions, there is documentation there. And for the most part, when you start to pick at some of the newer stuff, you can look through reflection, and most of that is documented, and then you start to get into some of the other stuff, and maybe it's not. But there is a concerted effort to make sure that there is strong developer documentation for these things. So WordPress, we're working in that direction as well. Codex is going to die at some point soon, if you've ever played with it. I had this really great conversation at the Automatic booth. So I don't work at Automatic, the folks behind WordPress.com, but I work full-time on the WordPress project. There are a few of them in the back. In fact, like half the room, I think, works at Automatic, so that's good. WordPress sometimes gets this complaint, like there's nothing for developers. There's nothing cool for developers in WordPress. It's hard to write in. I can't quickly spin something up. And I showed you that, well, no, it's actually really easy to do this, because I was actually talking about the WordCamp sites, for example, earlier, and this idea of like a speaker's post type. It's about like 6 lines of code to turn that on. That's it. So you need to define its basic definition, and suddenly it's done. But this idea of like no developer tools isn't true. We had this conversation earlier about how do I do this migration with this complex thing? I need to change the database for this different stuff. Well, there's a tool called WP-CLI. In fact, it was inspired by Drush for Drupal, which existed for years. It's been around for a really long time. I had to add someone as an editor to a site today, and I was already on the server, but I didn't really feel like logging in. So I just really quickly, like, WP user set role, and I just, boom, immediately, already done. I just had to walk away at that point. Incredibly powerful tool for doing upgrades, migrations, remote access, entire ecosystem around this alone. And there's a lot more tools than just this that I'm not even going to bother to mention. I do want to say that, like, hey, there are some really cool things. And this has been around for, I believe, 4 or 5 years now. It's not that new, but it is newer than 2009. So that's why I get to include it in this talk. And then there's the assumption of, like, WordPress has no API. Now, if you think about an API as being like PHP, well, that actually also might be true. But if you think about API as being this public-facing API, XMLRPC doesn't count. RSS feeds don't really count. Atom Pub was this really cool idea, and we're the only ones who ever bothered to try it. It was actually a terrible idea, but that's another story. Well, we have this REST API in development. It's been in development for more than a year now. It's really great. It's really awesome. It will really change everything. But one of the cool things about it is that we're not building just an API for WordPress content. We're building really like a management layer for people who are going to then probably construct their own APIs in a way that they can then talk to every other WordPress site. This is the crazy idea of like distributed applications where we have, in a good example is that in Drupal they have an XMLRPC extension, and I know other things as well. But it doesn't have any methods registered by default. When you're building your application, you have to register these methods and go with that. With us, we have like some of these methods built in where you have, you can do basic post and page management directly through there. Well, in the REST API, someone's going to end up adding this whole other aspect, and we need to now realize, okay, how are they going to discover these methods? So now we're starting to look at Hadios and JSON-HAL and all these different like specs and this hypermedia concept, and then we have to build this so like the WordPress mobile app can talk to every install out there without breaking, even though they're all their own little snowflake. This is actually a lot of fun. It's crazy as it sounds. It's a cool thing, and it also means that WordPress as a content store, which people are already doing, can do this even more. And the API is already running in production in a number of places, such as Wired and the New York Times are already using this. And obviously there are other smaller sites using it as well, but they're already playing with this, they're already using it. So it's already there. My final assumption is that WordPress sucks and it isn't getting better. This is most definitely false. I do think that it is constantly changing and it is for the better. Thank you very much, and I would love to hear maybe some of your other assumptions.